John 13, and we'll begin reading in verse 21. John 13, 21. When Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. There was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, said unto him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after that, the sup Satan entered unto him. Then said Jesus unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. Our gracious God, again, just for a moment, we ask that you would help us to understand these things. If you don't, even if we intellectually understand it, it certainly won't help us mentally or spiritually. It would just be words on the page. It'll be no different than reading the newspaper here today and gone. But we would ask that you would do things that only you can do, and not only that, that you would enjoy our attention towards you, giving attention to the reading of your word and now the explanation of it. And we're thankful again in Jesus' name. Amen. In the theology classes, there is a term that is known as the hypostatic union. The hypostatic union is referring to Christ, that he was 100% God and 100% man. Now, this seems odd because people normally would think, well, 50-50 adds up to 100, but the hypostatic union is referring to the fact that he was 100% God and still 100% human. And when we look through John's letters, John's gospel, he's different than any other of the evangelists because John wrote and recorded more of the divinity of Christ, and he reveals that to us. That's why the Gospel of John is one of the more despised books of the Bible by the Jews. And we've been dealing with the divinity of Christ and his attributes in the previous chapters, but as we move forward into this and we deal with Judas, the betrayer, I would like to bring out the fact that now this God-man is interacting with humans, that God is interacting with men on a human level. So when we look at this, not only do we look at it in a theological way, but we can also look at it in the field of study of anthropology, the study of human behavior. And now looking here as we jump in, and we're looking at one of the most infamous acts of human behavior, which is the betrayal of Jesus Christ. In verse 21 it says, When Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And then what we have immediately is the human reaction to those words. Verse 22 says, the disciples looked one on another. They're in silence. They just look at each other with their eyes, and though that nothing was said, there still is communication that we see at the table after Jesus announces that. They look on one another, so you see facial expressions one toward another. They're looking at each other back and forth. There's some body language that is being communicated back and forth as they sit there. Definitely on the part of Judas, because you know that if somebody is in that situation and they are just publicly called out at the table, one of you shall betray me, and we know he knows that he is the one, in fact. So you know that his blood pressure just rises, his eyes are roaming. A person of psychology would know if you looked at it through a video cam, obviously this person has some guilt. But all of them really have communications, because it says the disciples, all of them looked one on another, doubting of whom Jesus spake. And it's an intense moment. And then we see that other anthropology, if we look in verse 23, it says there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. And at first you think, well, that's odd. Two men, one of them leaning upon his chest. It says actually leaning upon his breast. They're laying down on a couch, and one of the men is actually leaning up against his chest. And that may seem odd to us, but we're looking at a very close relationship here, where there's emotional and spiritual combat. Some of us are familiar with that, and some of us aren't. Some of you have engaged in spiritual combat, and you know that your blood pressure rises. You know that it becomes emotional, sometimes actually hostile. But during regular combat, we see that takes place between soldiers, even in the wintertime, when they're freezing out in the cold, that the soldiers will lay in the trench and actually will lay together almost on the top of each other just to keep each other warm from freezing to death. And you can see how that would link these two men in an emotional, a spiritual, a physical way. In verse 24, Simon Peter, look at the communication again. It says, Simon Peter, therefore, he notices what's happening, and it says that he beckoned to him. They are so close, and he knows that John probably is younger at this time. John might only be 16 years old compared to Jesus at 33. And so he knows that he has this kind of a connection. It's a high-pressure situation. So Peter does something with his hands, and also, I would believe, a whisper. And this is a very intense moment. He has just announced one of the 12 is going to betray him. So he beckons with them. You can see kind of discreetly in whispers, and he says, hey, John, he beckons to him and that ask who it should be of whom he's talking about. And you can see this play out in your mind. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, saith unto him, again, I believe in a whisper, who is it? Now you realize this is happening in the sight of everybody at the table. This needs to play out in your mind as a movie. I mean, this is one of the greatest drama scenes that has ever been. He announces something so tragic, and then he's got whispering and beckoning at the table. Hey, we've all been there in that situation where we're talking, and then somebody says something rank about somebody else, and you're like, whoa, I'm standing here. They're all here at the table. And there's whispering and motions of hands to try to kind of conceal some communication. Who is it? Verse 26, Jesus, in a whisper, again, I believe trying to conceal it, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. When I pick up the bread and we're passing it around and I dip it, you'll find out. Then we have a further facial body change. I mean, this is a drastic change because it says in verse 27, after that, Satan entered into him. The nervousness of Judas when he knows that he knows. He knows. He knows it's me. His face is beet red. He's not making eye contact with anyone. He knows. You find that facial expression would drastically change as Satan enters into him and he becomes from sheepish to bold. He is empowered now by Satan. He's emboldened to do the deed. Of course, all the team, they're at a loss. They don't know. They don't know who he's talking about, and they think, well, maybe it's something to do with Judas. I don't know, because he has the bag. But either way, they don't really fully understand because they got other things on their mind. There's a lot happening here. Then you come down to verse 36, and Peter then he pipes up. He says, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Whither I go, thou cannot follow me now, but thou shalt follow me afterward." And look what Peter says. And I believe, again, this he might be raising his voice just a bit. Peter says unto him, "Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake." And I think that Peter at this moment, he means well. I think he's being disingenuous. I believe that he means it. But psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, he doesn't understand. I know for a fact that at this point, he certainly does not understand the level of spiritual combat that is taking place. He cannot see the devil enter into Judas. I don't even know if he recognizes or knows that they're at a loss. But he cannot physically understand, or emotionally, spiritually, he doesn't understand the spiritual combat that is taking place at this table. Just the other day, we were out riding around, and we were having a conversation with a few bikers at a Greasy Spoon. And you heard the adage, you can't talk about religion and politics. Which generally I do. But why can't you? Why can't you talk of those two particular things? We talk about everything else, and we can talk about anything at all. We can disagree about just about anything at all, but you can't talk of those two things because it's spiritual combat. It makes people feel so uncomfortable. You could crawl out of your skin. So we were having this conversation, something came up, and I mentioned Trump, and all of a sudden the hostilities and the knives are out, and we're banging on the table. But I quickly changed it, because it isn't really about Trump. It's spiritual. So we had our conversation, and we went on, and then when we left, I shook hands with the gentleman, and I said, this isn't really about Trump. I'm more concerned that you make it home. And he said, I'm not worried. I said, I know. And I just looked at him. But I also told him, I said, look, I've been a pastor of a church now for over 25 years. I've been working for the boss. And I know some men of God have been working for the Lord for 40, 50 years, ancient men, good men. I said, but I have close to 25 years involved in this, and I have seen things, and I have, by Lord's grace, just by being in the business of the boss, you see things, you begin to know, you can pick up stuff. It happens so often now that you can tell the working when the Spirit works. And and we were talking, and we were bantering back and forth, and it was good. We're men, we can do that. But he said one thing. He said, I cannot vote for Trump because of his character. And then I replied, the Lord has used you. And you can see the Spirit of the Lord move his face. You could see the look on his face that the Spirit of God just moved. He goes, the Lord has never used me. And I go, yes, he has. You know it. Here's the thing. He chose to not ride with us the rest of the ride. So he rode home all by himself. And I can assure you this, brothers. When you're riding around on a bike, all you do is think. And I will bet the farm that the Spirit of God was working on that man the whole ride home. Peter here is entering spiritual combat that is causing the boys to tremble. I will go with you, he says. I will lay down my life for thy sake. But look what Jesus responds in 38. He answered him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Really? For verily, verily, I say unto you, the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me thrice. The humanity of it. I believe that Peter was genuine and honorable in saying what he said. But the spiritual combat mixed in with the humanity of him. His spirit is willing, but his flesh is weak. We are entering into a scene or territory that is unknown to him. He's not familiar with it. And John, as he's recording these things, he brings this out. And in his, I think by the time if we move over to 1 John into his epistle, we realize that he starts to record certain things. If you turn over there to 1 John 1, he's an older man now, so he was the youngest of the group, and by now when he writes, he's probably close to 90 years old, and 90-year-old men have a tendency to become very sentimental. But I want you to notice the anthropology that he writes here in his letter in 1 John 1. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes. He magnifies the human experience. In his gospel, he's magnifying the divine experience. But here in this letter, as he's an old man and he's reminded of what took place, I mean, think of that. John's just a man. He's got a mother. He's got a father. He's probably got brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins. He's a normal human being. He's just like us. But it just so happens that he happens to live at the time when Jesus, the Son of God, would walk the earth. And it just so seemingly happens that he would be picked as one of the 12. He had life. He was a child. His mom had dreams for him. Hey, I think you should go off to school and become something like this. And maybe we know in all the aspirations of the family business. And it's all derailed because the Son of God stepped into eternity. And look what John says, though. Hey, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes. We have seen these things. We saw it. We saw him. We didn't just hear. We didn't just read about it in a book. We didn't see pictures of Jesus painted with beautiful brown hair and blue eyes. We literally saw him. We saw him with our eyes, which we have looked upon. The human element that we miss as we're reading through these verses, that they are. We seen him with our eyes. We looked upon him. Our hands have handled the very word of life. For the life was manifested. And look at again, he magnifies the fact we have seen it and bear witness. It's not just pictures. Now again, not just heard. The sights, the sounds, the smells. They lived it. It was real. Verse 3, that which we have seen and heard. We lived it, and we're trying to communicate this with you. We declare we unto you that you also may have fellowship with us, and truly our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son, Jesus Christ. And these things write we unto you, that your joy might be full. The human element of it. We're people. Sometimes we get into the upper echelons of theology and we forget that we're all human sinners here. If God could use Trump, he can use you, he could use me despite ourselves. Sometimes I sit here and when the team is singing, I'm reminded, of that Molly was born here in the church. She is one of the team. She's one of the flock, like all of us. Now, some of you have been here 4 or 5 years, 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, but we're becoming this flock, And you think all the things that are taking place as we travel to the promised land. Some that have passed. You see benches out there with Steve Schwann's name on them. He's there already. And there have been many. But the human element of this, Luke picks up on this in his gospel in chapter 22. Look over there. The human element. Luke 22, we're in the Garden of Gethsemane, where a vast amount of spiritual warfare is taking place. But we're also seeing the human element of it in Jesus himself. Verse 42, he's praying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared unto him an angel from heaven who was strengthening him, because the anxiety that he was dealing with and the fear was bringing him almost to a nervous breakdown. And so an angel comes, I believe, to help him actually to live because of the stress. He might go into full cardiac arrest, because verse 44 says, being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, so much so that his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Through the pores from just the stress of the upcoming events in his prayer, his pores are opening up and dripping drops of blood, so much so they're coming down across his eyes, across his nose, and dripping off of his chin. Blood. And of course, by the time you get down to verse 48, we have the dastardly deed. Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? And then we know the story. They come to take him away in the garden. It's a little incident with a sword, but Peter follows him because he means well. He genuinely means well, and so he's following him at a distance. 54 says, Then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. You think, wait, well, that's certainly not heroic, Peter. I thought you said you would lay down your life for my sake, and here we are. He's going through the trauma of it, and you're sitting with them amidst the fire, warming yourselves. Certainly not coming in guns a-blazing. "55, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and look at this, and earnestly looked upon him." Again, just the eye contact. Now he knows She sees that he sees. It's the same situation. He knows that he knows that she knows. And they're making eye contact. And there's communication happening. This man was also with them. She pipes up out loud. He was with him. And look, he denies it. And he denied him, saying, "Woman, I know him not." And you think, Peter, what are you doing? What are you doing? They just call you out and you collapse and you were cowardice? I don't know him? That is the pressure of spiritual warfare. No, I don't know him. But look, it's increasing. Verse 58, after a little while, another saw him and said, "Thou art also of them." Again, Peter, he collapses and he cowards. And Peter said, "Man, I am not." Now the blood pressure and the tones of his voice are increasing. I am not. Now look, at about the space of 1 hour, after another confidently affirmed, saying of a truth, "This fellow also was with him." You can hear the demons are beating their swords together. They're clanking and clanking their swords, accusing him, saying, "You were with him. You were with him. We recognize you. You're a Galilean. You're from his pact. We know." And you can just hear the swords just rattling, the saber rattling of the spiritual warfare that nobody can see, but it's happening. And he's collapsing under the pressure. Peter the apostle. More and more and more and more, so tense, till finally, verse 60, Peter said, "Man, I know not what thou sayest." And immediately, while he spake, the cock crew. And then the bomb goes off. Verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at him. Through the corner of his eye, with his face bloodied up now and swollen, right at the exact moment when Peter says, "I don't know the man," they make eye contact. And the humanity of it is so overwhelming. The spiritual warfare is so overwhelming that Peter breaks down totally. The Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And a rush of memories. And there's something of when a grown man cries. They say it's psychiatrically or psychology or something that there's something about a human being seeing visually another human being cry. That there literally something is triggered in the brain that causes empathy naturally at the sight of tears. And tears themselves are the strangest thing that the Lord has put into our mind and into our souls. How somehow, some way, emotion of empathy and all the things that go with that somehow trigger in our mind the electronics and send electrical impulses right from the brain to the cords, to the eyes, to the ducts that make water come out of our ducts to the point where they drip down our face. God has made us that way for empathy. And here, the God who created those tear ducts, by those eyes, turns at the same moment when he is breaking and looked at him. And he collapses beneath the load. And Peter And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. But brothers, nothing was said. Because nothing needed to be said. He knows it. That is what we are dealing with. We are dealing with spiritual warfare to make sure that the people we know and love and care for do not come to the light, to the point where grown men will cry. When I was coming to the Lord, I would just throw things out, to different people, I don't know. And it's interesting that the response normally is, well, Christians, they just can't get through life and they just need a crutch. So they're just like mamby-pamby, they just need this crutch in life because they can't get through. And I think to myself, now that I know, I don't think those men could handle a day in the life of a Christian who engages in spiritual warfare. We didn't sign up for this. We were drafted. We were handpicked by him to do it. And there is nobody else to do it. We're it.